George sat at the kitchen table, his tired eyes fixed on the cup of tea in his hands. The small room where he lived with his grandson Charlie was plain, with old furniture and worn walls that reflected years of hardship. At 75, George felt the weight of age more than ever, especially the responsibility of caring for Charlie alone. The boy, only 8 years old, was the light of his life, but he carried too heavy a burden for one so young. "Grandpa, don't I go to school today?" asked Charlie, sitting on the couch with a mixture of curiosity and exhaustion. His frail body was showing signs of a serious illness, which George was doing his best to treat, but money was always short. George sighed deeply and looked at his grandson with a soft smile to hide his concern. "Not today, Charlie. Let's go for a walk in the park, will you say? It'll be nice to get some fresh air." The boy smiled slightly, excited at the thought of getting out of the house, though he knew his body couldn't take it for long. George finished his tea, struggled to his feet, and reached for his shabby coat on the hanger. He dressed slowly, feeling the pain in his joints, but trying not to show it to Charlie. "I know you're tired, Grandpa," Charlie said, watching him closely. George paused for a moment and looked at his grandson, surprised at the realization. "Tired? Not at all, my son. I still have plenty of energy." He winked and patted Charlie on the shoulder, who laughed softly. The truth was, George didn't know how much longer he could keep that energy up, with medical bills piling up and days of hard work already behind him. Charlie's illness was serious. Treatment required more than George could muster. He had sold almost everything he owned to pay for consultations and medication, but he was running out of money and options. The feeling of helplessness grew with each passing day, but George never let Charlie realize the extent to which it was consuming him. "When I'm better, I'll be able to play ball in the park again, won't I, Grandpa?" asked Charlie as he put on his coat, which he had outgrown a bit. Jorge nodded, although he knew that the chances of a full recovery depended on a financial miracle, which seemed increasingly distant. "Of course, Champ, and when that happens, I'll be your official doorman." Charlie laughed, although the last time he had run free in the park seemed like a distant memory. It was important to him to have his grandfather around, and George's presence gave him security, even in the midst of hardship. Ready to go, George opened the front door and looked up at the blue sky. "It's going to be a good day today, Charlie," he said, more to himself than to his grandson. Charlie ran out of the house, his little body fighting the weakness he felt, but his young spirit still glowing. George followed him with his eyes and felt his heart clench. He would do anything for the boy, but the more days that passed, the more unbearable it became for him to realize that he had no options left. The treatment Charlie needed was far beyond what he could afford on his modest pension. As they walked side by side, George kept his dark thoughts to himself and focused on the present. The park was not far away, and just being together and breathing the fresh air brought momentary relief to both of them. "Grandpa, will the doctor really cure me?" asked Charlie in a moment of silence, his voice soft and hopeful. George felt a lump in his throat, but forced himself to smile. "Of course it is, Charlie. We just have to find a way to get what we're missing, and everything will be fine." With every step he took, George thought about the bills he had to pay and what else he could sell to make more money. He had worked all his life, but nothing would have prepared him for the challenge of raising a sick grandson with so few resources. Still, he would never let Charlie know how much this bothered him. "We're gonna have fun today," George said, changing the subject. "Let's go count how many birds we see in the park, okay?" Charlie grinned. "I think I'm winning the game, Grandpa." And with that, the two set off for the park, trying, if only for a little while, to forget the weight of reality around them. For George, every moment with Charlie was precious, and he knew he would do anything to secure his grandson's future, even if he didn't know exactly how. As he watched Charlie run around laughing, George muttered to himself, "We'll find a way." Somehow, the sun was shining in the sky and a light breeze stirred the leaves on the trees in the park. George and Charlie walked side by side, enjoying the peaceful morning. For Charlie, this simple walk was one of the few opportunities he had to feel free, even if his body was no longer the same. He looked around with curious eyes, while George directed his pace slowly, but ever attentive, towards his grandson. "Look, Grandpa, "The park is full of squirrels today," Charlie shouted, pointing to a nearby tree where two squirrels were running and climbing up the trunk. George smiled. "Yes, I think they're getting ready for winter. They must be stocking up, just like we're getting ready for the hard days." Charlie, who was always very observant, looked at his grandfather with a slight smile. "So they're just like you, Grandpa? Always keeping everything tidy?" George laughed softly. "I think so, but I'm not as quick as they are." They continued walking through the park until suddenly Charlie stopped walking. His eyes focused on something lying on the ground near a bench. He frowned and slowly approached it. "Grandpa, come look at this," he shouted, bending down to pick it up. Jorge, curious, approached. As he got closer, he saw that Charlie was holding a beautiful, expensive-looking leather backpack. It looked like it had been there a long time and was lying carelessly on the floor. George, looking worried, crouched down next to Charlie. "Let me see, boy," he said, taking the backpack from his grandson's hand. "It doesn't look like it was left for no reason." He looked around, but the park was relatively empty. A few people were walking by from a distance, but no one seemed to be looking for a lost backpack. George sighed and knew he had to do the right thing. Charlie looked at his grandfather curiously. "What's in there, Grandpa? Can we find out who it belongs to?" George hesitated for a moment. He knew it was wrong to snoop through other people's things, but he also had to try to find the owner. He carefully unzipped the backpack. To his surprise, what he saw inside left him speechless for a moment. Inside were bundles of bills and some important documents and papers. "My God," George muttered as he looked at the contents. "That's a fortune." Charlie's eyes widened. "Grandpa, there's a lot of money in there. Can we use it to help me? Maybe then you won't have to work so hard." Jorge felt the weight of Charlie's words, which made him stop and think for a moment. The money in there was enough to pay for Charlie's treatment, and there would still be enough left over to guarantee them a better life. The temptation was great, and he felt his heart pounding at the prospect of finally finding a solution to the problems they faced. But as he looked at his grandson, he knew there was something more important than money. He took a deep breath and looked at Charlie, trying to be as clear as possible. "Charlie, I know this money could help a lot, but it's not ours. Someone has lost it and probably needs it as much as we do. We can't keep something that isn't ours, no matter how great the temptation." Charlie seemed to ponder his grandfather's words, but there was still a hint of disappointment in his voice. "But Grandpa, what if the person never comes to pick it up? Couldn't we keep a portion of it?" George laughed softly and put his hand on his grandson's shoulder. "You know, Charlie, what's right is always right, even when no one is looking. Let's do the right thing and try to find the owner of the backpack. If it was our money, we want someone else to do the same, wouldn't we?" Charlie sighed, but nodded. "All right, Grandpa, let's find the owner." George stood up, picked up the backpack carefully, and took Charlie's hand tightly. "All right, let's see what we can do to get the backpack back. I'm sure the owner will be very relieved." And with that, they set off on their way back to the park, George with a lighter heart, knowing he had made the right decision, and Charlie, though still a little confused, trusting his grandfather. George and Charlie headed home with the fancy leather backpack in hand. With every step, George felt the weight of the decision he had made. The money he was carrying could have solved all his problems, but deep down he knew that giving it back was the right thing to do. Still, the temptation persisted, and he tried to push away the idea of how it could change their lives. When he got home, he set the backpack on the kitchen table, sat down heavily in the chair, and wiped his forehead with his hand as Charlie watched him silently. The boy knew his grandfather was worried, but he still didn't understand why they couldn't use the money for the treatment they so desperately needed. "Grandpa," Charlie began hesitantly, "doesn't the person who lost him even miss him? We could use just what we need, just enough to help me." George looked at his grandson with a sad smile, recognizing the innocence behind the question. He leaned forward and gripped Charlie's small hands tightly. "I know it sounds like the perfect solution, Charlie," he said quietly, "but it would be a mistake to use that money. It doesn't belong to us. If we do, we'll be taking something that doesn't belong to us, and that will haunt us forever. I've always told you that what matters in life is to be honest, even if no one sees it." Charlie looked down, still confused but trusting his grandfather's words. "I understand, Grandpa. But what if we don't find the owner? What will happen then? George sighed, got up, and started searching for identity documents in his backpack. He knew he had to try to find the owner, but he also knew it wouldn't be easy. As he flipped through the papers and looked through the envelopes, something finally caught his eye. "Look at this," he said, holding up an envelope to Charlie. "It has the owner's name on it. It looks like this bag belongs to Mr. Anderson." "Who is it?" asked Charlie curiously. George frowned and tried to remember. The name sounded vaguely familiar. "If I'm not mistaken, he's a very wealthy man who lives in the posh part of town. I've never seen him in person, but I've heard he's a millionaire who lives in seclusion." Charlie's eyes widened. "So he doesn't need the money? If he's so rich, why doesn't he leave it to us?" George laughed softly and shook his head. "It doesn't work that way, son. Just because someone has more money than us doesn't mean we should keep what's his." "But you won't even miss it," insisted Charlie. George patiently replied, "He may not miss the money, but it's still his. We can't decide what's right or wrong based on what other people have or don't have. What matters is what we know is right." Charlie nodded, still trying to process the statement. "So what do we do now, Grandpa?" George was silent for a moment, staring at the backpack on the table. He knew what he had to do, but the thought of going to a millionaire's mansion to return a fortune to him was daunting. Still, he had no choice. "I had to do the right thing. We'll go to his mansion tomorrow," George finally said. "We'll return the backpack and explain what happened. It's the right thing to do." Charlie looked at his grandfather admiringly. "You always know the right thing to do, Grandpa." George smiled and put his hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Not always, Charlie, but I try to do the best I can." That night, as Charlie slept, George sat at the table contemplating his backpack as he felt the weight of what he would do the next day. Temptation still lurked in the back of his mind. It was easy to think that a rich man like Anderson would never miss the money, that he wouldn't care. But George knew that honesty was something he would never give up. He had taught it to Charlie, and he couldn't be the man to contradict his own lessons. "It's never easy to do the right thing," he muttered to himself as he got up to turn out the light. The next morning, George rose early. He dressed as best he could, although his clothes were already quite worn by time. Charlie, excited and curious, was quick to get ready as well. They gathered their backpacks and set off on foot for the well-to-do part of town, where Mr. Anderson's imposing estate was located. "Is everything going to be all right, Grandpa?" asked Charlie as they walked. "It'll be fine, son," George replied, trying to sound confident. "It's going to be all right. It always does when you do the right thing." George didn't know what to expect when he arrived at the mansion. He just knew that whatever happened, he would be at peace with himself because he had taken the path of honesty. When George and Charlie pulled into the driveway of Mr. Anderson's mansion, they were impressed by the size of the property. The wrought iron gates and the huge three-story house conveyed a sense of opulence they had only seen in the movies. To Charlie, it all seemed magical, as if they were entering a completely different world. George felt a certain hesitation in his chest. He knew they had to do the right thing, but the thought of coming face to face with such a powerful and wealthy man made him nervous. "Grandpa, do you think he'll welcome us?" asked Charlie, firmly taking his grandfather's hand between his own. George looked at his grandson and tried to smile, though he was worried. "I don't know, Charlie, but the important thing is that we're here to do the right thing." Sighing, George pressed the intercom on the side of the gate. A few seconds passed, and a firm voice sounded over the speakers. "Yes? Who is this?" "My name is George. My grandson and I have found a backpack belonging to Mr. Anderson. We'd like to return it to you," George said, feeling a little awkward as he spoke. There was a pause, and then the voice replied suspiciously, "Wait a moment." The two stood looking at the huge garden on the other side of the gate, with perfectly manicured flowers and a marble fountain in the distance. Charlie looked around, fascinated, but George was tense, waiting for the next response. Soon the gates opened with a slight creak, and a tall, serious man in an impeccable suit approached them. It was one of the estate's employees. His eyes scrutinized George and Charlie with a critical gaze. "You said you found a backpack, sir?" the man asked in a tone that suggested suspicion rather than gratitude. George nodded and held out the leather knapsack. "Yes, we found it yesterday in the park. I believe it belongs to Mr. Anderson." I saw his name on some of the papers inside. The waiter looked closely at the backpack but didn't take it immediately. Instead, he frowned, as if assessing the situation with some skepticism. "I have to check the contents before I return it to Mr. Anderson," he said, finally reaching out to take the backpack. George felt a twinge of unease. He knew he had done the right thing by returning the backpack, but the way the waiter was looking at them made it seem like he had something to hide. "Everything is exactly as we found it. We haven't touched anything. We're just looking for the owner's name to return it to him." The man didn't answer. He just nodded and began to open the backpack right in front of George and Charlie. He pulled out the bundles of money and documents and examined each item closely. Charlie watched with watchful eyes as George took a firm stance and hoped that everything would be cleared up quickly. At that moment, the man paused and frowned even more. "Something's missing," he said, his tone growing sharper and sharper. George frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "A gold watch," the man replied, clutching his backpack tightly. "Mr. Anderson always carries a valuable gold watch in this bag, and it's not here." George's heart skipped a beat. He knew he hadn't touched anything apart from the documents and money, which were clearly visible. "We didn't take any watches. Everything that was in the backpack when we found it is in there." The waiter stared at him, eyes full of suspicion. "That's what everyone says, isn't it?" Charlie saw the tension rising and tugged on George's shirt sleeve. "Grandpa, we haven't done anything wrong, have we?" George looked at his grandson and shook his hand firmly. "No, Charlie, we haven't done anything wrong. We're just trying to give back what's not ours." But the waiter didn't look satisfied. "I think you'd better wait here. I'll call Mr. Anderson and tell him what's going on." He turned and started on his way back to the house with his backpack. George felt a mixture of frustration and anxiety. They had done everything right, but now they were being blamed for something they hadn't done. He looked at Charlie, who looked worried, and tried to reassure him. "Don't worry, kid. The truth always comes out. We'll wait and see what happens and work it out." A few minutes passed, and the silence between them was heavy. Charlie, who was normally full of energy, seemed calmer than usual. He looked at his grandfather with confidence, but George knew the boy was trying to understand why they were being treated this way, even though they had done the right thing. Soon the imposing figure of Mr. Anderson appeared in the doorway of the mansion and walked toward them with a firm step. He was a middle-aged man with a serious expression and a penetrating gaze. As he approached, George realized that the man would not be so easily fooled. "So you found my backpack?" asked Anderson in a direct tone, his eyes fixed on George and then on Charlie. "Yes, sir. We found it yesterday in the park and brought it in. We didn't touch anything except the owner's identity papers," George replied in a firm but respectful voice. Anderson looked at the clerk, who nodded, indicating that he had already checked the contents. "But something seems to be missing, doesn't it?" George took a deep breath. "We don't know anything about any watches, sir. We brought it all in just as we found it." Mr. Anderson was silent for a moment, watching them with a gaze that seemed to pierce them. George knew that, in situations like this, words would not suffice. They would have to prove their honesty somehow. But how? The air around George seemed heavy as Mr. Anderson watched him with critical eyes. Distrust was clearly visible on the millionaire's face, and George felt the tension growing. Although his conscience was clear, he knew he had done nothing wrong, but being unfairly accused made him uncomfortable. "I know how this sounds," George began, trying to remain calm, "but I swear we didn't touch anything besides the documents to find out who they belonged to. We didn't see any gold watches." Mr. Anderson folded his arms, still analyzing George and Charlie. The silence lengthened, and Charlie, who had remained quiet until then, began to tug anxiously at the sleeve of George's jacket. "Grandpa, the man with the backpack was fiddling with it while we were waiting. I saw him," Charlie said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. George looked at his grandson in confusion and then turned to Mr. Anderson. "What my grandson says, while we were waiting, the waiter who greeted us was fiddling with his backpack. Maybe he saw something." Mr. Anderson frowned, visibly surprised by that accusation. He slowly turned to waiter Richard, who had remained silent until then. observing everything from a distance with an expression of false neutrality. "Is it true?" asked Anderson in a low but authoritative voice. Richard seemed to hesitate for a moment, but then adopted a defensive posture. "Sir, I was just checking to make sure all the items were there. But the watch wasn't in the backpack when they arrived." The suggestion made Jorge's blood boil. Despite all the difficulties he had to face, it would never occur to him to steal something that didn't belong to him, least of all in front of his grandson, whom he wanted to teach honesty. He took a deep breath and tried to maintain control. "I know we're in a complicated situation," George said, keeping his cool. "But we're just trying to return what doesn't belong to us. We haven't stolen anything, and my grandson clearly saw something that warrants an investigation." Mr. Anderson seemed to ponder for a moment. His eyes narrowed as he looked at Richard. The atmosphere was tense, and Charlie, who was normally full of energy, stepped closer to George and gripped his hand tightly. "I don't like being falsely accused," Anderson said, looking directly at Richard. "And I don't like lies. Charlie saw you rummaging through the backpack, so I want to know exactly what happened." Richard began to sweat, his initial confidence seeming to fade. He glanced nervously at George and Charlie, then at Anderson, trying to keep his composure. "Sir, I was just making sure all the items were there, as I always do," Richard repeated, but his voice sounded less convincing now. I only touched on the essentials." But Anderson didn't seem satisfied with that answer. He looked at George again, as if reconsidering his first impression. "If the clock is missing, that's a serious problem. But there seems to be more to this story than I thought." At that point, Charlie, realizing that the truth was coming out, plucked up his courage and approached Anderson. In a low voice, he said, "I saw you take something shiny out of your backpack, sir. I'm sure of it. He put it in his pocket before you left." Charlie's words seemed to hang in the air, and Anderson stared at Richard, who was now visibly uncomfortable. Anderson's expression changed from suspicion to something more serious. He began to fit the pieces of the puzzle together. "Richard," Anderson said with a calmness that was more frightening than any shout, "let me see your bags." The waiter hesitated for a moment, but knew he had no choice. Slowly, he began to empty his pockets and pulled out a bunch of keys, a handkerchief, and finally the gold watch. At that moment, the air seemed to be sucked out of the room. George and Charlie were silent, while Richard stared pale at the watch in his hand. Mr. Anderson held out his hand without moving a muscle. Richard handed him the watch without a word. "So that's it," Mr. Anderson said in a low, controlled voice. He turned to George and Charlie, his eyes full of guilt. "It seems I've been blaming the wrong people." George, feeling the tension ease, merely shook his head. "No problem, Mr. Anderson. The important thing is that the truth is out." Charlie, wide-eyed and bright, looked at his grandfather with a relieved smile. "I knew Grandpa wouldn't let anyone think he'd done anything wrong." Mr. Anderson, still holding his watch, looked at Richard with a mixture of disappointment and anger. "You're fired, Richard, and I hope you've learned something about honesty at this point." Richard curtsied and left quietly. As Anderson turned to George and Charlie, his look now completely different. "I apologize for this whole mess. It was wrong to judge you two without knowing the whole story." George shrugged and tried to keep his tone light. "Life has taught me that things are not always what they seem at first glance. What matters is that everything turned out all right." Anderson took a deep breath and seemed calmer. "I owe you a lot. And I don't just mean the return of the backpack. The honesty you showed today, it's not something you see every day." He looked at Charlie and then at George, and a new decision seemed to form in his mind. "You both did something that a lot of people wouldn't do, and that's why I want to help you. Let's make sure Charlie gets the treatment he needs. Consider it my way of thanking you for showing me that there is still good in the world." George was surprised and felt tears welling up in his eyes, but he blinked quickly to hold them back. I don't even know what to say, Mr. Anderson. I'm so grateful to you. This means more to me than you can imagine." Excited, Charlie hugged his grandfather tightly. "Grandpa, we did it. It's going to be all right now." George looked at his grandson and then at Anderson, who smiled gratefully. "Yes, son, it's going to be all right." And in that moment, George knew that, despite all the difficulties, he had once again done the right thing and changed the destiny of his life. After the unexpected outcome with Richard and Mr. Anderson's promise to help them, George and Charlie were invited to the manor house. The heavy air of distrust had dissipated and the atmosphere was much lighter, almost friendly. George, still somewhat dazed by the events, walked slowly through the luxurious corridors of the house, marveling at what he saw, but with a modesty that prevented him from feeling at ease in such opulent surroundings. Mr. Anderson led them into a large room, furnished with leather furniture and artwork on the walls. Everything there exuded wealth and good taste, but also a coldness that reflected the reserved life of the owner of the house. Anderson directed them to sit down, and soon one of the servants, who had nothing to do with Richard, brought a tray with tea and cookies. Charlie looked at his grandfather, whose eyes were still full of curiosity and admiration for what they were experiencing. "Grandpa, I've never seen such a big house," he said almost in a whisper. Poor Hay smiled at his grandson, trying to hide his own surprise. "Neither have I, my boy, but remember that size and luxury aren't everything in life." Mr. Anderson, who had overheard the conversation, smiled slightly. "George, you're absolutely right. When you have so much money, it's easy to forget what's really important. I think sometimes we cut ourselves off from the simple things that really make us happy." George nodded and tried to understand what Anderson really meant. "I think we all search for meaning in life in some way. I found mine when I was taking care of Charlie." Mr. Anderson watched George for a moment and thought about his words. There was something in the millionaire's eyes that suggested a deep loneliness, a lack of human connection that all the wealth in the world could not compensate for. He took a deep breath and, after a brief silence, spoke sincerely. "George, I want to explain to you what prompted me to help you. It wasn't just honesty, although there was reason enough. I saw something in you and your nieto, something that reminded me of what I lost a long time ago." George leaned forward a little curious. "And what was that supposed to be, Mr. Anderson?" Anderson smiled sadly, his eyes lost in the distance for a moment. "My wife and I had a son. He'd be Charlie's age now, but he died when he was little. My life changed drastically after that. I got away from everything, focused on work, my business, and the village became a sort of sanctuary, or maybe a prison, depending on how you look at it." Charlie, who had been listening to the story quietly, looked at Anderson with wide, sympathetic eyes. "I'm sorry, sir." Anderson nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Charlie. You remind me a little of my son. The curious nature, the twinkle in the eye. That's why something in me woke up when you two showed up. Maybe I was waiting for a chance to do something right again, to connect with something real." George, moved by Anderson's words, realized that the man before him was much more than a lonely millionaire. There was pain, regret, and above all, a desire to find meaning in life again. He didn't quite know how to respond, but he sensed that his presence at Charlie's side was somehow bringing about a positive change in the lonely man. "Mr. Anderson," George said after a pause, "I can't imagine the pain you've been through, but I think what you're doing today, helping Charlie, already shows how big your heart is. We don't have much to say in return other than our gratitude, but we know you're giving us a second chance, and that means a lot to us." Anderson smiled for the first time since they had entered the house, a genuine smile that lit up his face in another way. "Your gratitude is all I need. Maybe I've lost too much, but I think I still have time to do some good." Charlie, who was always so direct, asked with his typical innocence, "Will we see more of you now, Mr. Anderson?" Anderson looked at the boy, touched by the simplicity of the question, and replied, "I hope so, Charlie. And you can call me John. There's no need for such formality among friends." George and Charlie smiled, and the mood lightened. The formality that had previously lingered in the air vanished, and for the first time Anderson seemed more human, less distant. "Now," Anderson continued, "let's talk about what's really important. I've already contacted a specialist who can help with Charlie's treatment. He's one of the best in the country, and I want to make sure you have everything you need. From now on, you won't have to worry about the cost of treatment." George felt a lump in his throat. It was much more than he expected. It was more than a kind gesture. It was the assurance that Charlie would have a chance at a healthy life, something he had thought for so long he could never offer his grandson. "I don't even know what to say, John. You're saving my grandson's life. I can never thank you enough." George said, his voice breaking. Anderson shook his head. You don't have to thank me, George. I'm just doing what needs to be done. And in a way, you two were helping me find something I thought I'd lost forever. The silence that followed was very meaningful. It was as if in that moment a new friendship was sealed, not based on interests, but on a mutual understanding of what's really important in life. Connection, honesty, and a willingness to do good. After a while, Anderson stood up and indicated that they had already talked about the essentials for the day. Let's keep in touch. I'll do everything I can to get Charlie started on treatment as soon as possible. And I want you to know that my home is always open to you. George shook Anderson's hand firmly, his heart full of gratitude and renewed hope. Thank you so much, John. This means more to me than you know. With a final look of thanks, George and Charlie said their goodbyes and left the house feeling that their lives had finally taken a turn for the better. A few days after their meeting with Mr. Anderson, George and Charlie were back in their cottage, but now with a sense of hope they hadn't felt in a long time. Charlie was excited and told everyone that his grandfather had met a millionaire who would pay for his treatment. George was still taking it all in. He had been through so many hardships in the past few years that he still found it hard to believe that his luck had changed suddenly and so unexpectedly. One morning, as they were eating breakfast, the phone rang. George got up, picked up the receiver and answered. A familiar, polite voice answered on the other end of the line. George, this is John Anderson. I hope all is well with you and Charlie. We're fine, John. Thanks for asking, George replied, surprised but glad to get the call. Glad to hear it, Anderson said. I wanted to update you on Charlie's treatment. I've managed to set up an appointment with a specialist for next week. I'll send a car to pick you up and take you to the clinic. George was silent for a moment, taking in the information. This is unbelievable, John. I don't know how to thank you for all this. Charlie is so excited. You don't need to thank me, George. You've done something few people would do. Your honesty has touched me deeply, and helping Charlie is the least I can do, Anderson replied. He talks about you all the time. You know that, said George, looking over at Charlie, who was trying to listen to the conversation with a smile on his face. Really, laughed Anderson. I'd love to see you again. I've even thought about doing something special. How about a ride on the weekend? Maybe you could come spend a day with us. Charlie can play in the garden, and we can talk some more. George was surprised by the invitation, but he knew Charlie would be delighted. I'm sure he'd love it. We'll gladly accept the invitation. After the call, George told Charlie the news, and Charlie was delighted. Are we going back to Mr. Anderson's estate, Grandpa? How nice. I'm going to go back and play in the huge garden. Yes, little boy. Looks like our new friend wants to spend some time with us, George said, smiling at Charlie's delight. On Saturday, as they had agreed, they were picked up by a car. George and Charlie, now more familiar with the situation, were welcomed into the Anderson mansion as if they were old friends. The atmosphere in the house was much more welcoming this time. Anderson greeted them in the foyer with a genuine smile on his face. George, Charlie, how nice of you to come, Anderson said, opening his arms in a welcoming gesture. You are my special guest today. Charlie, ever curious, immediately asked, May we play in the garden, Mr. Anderson? Anderson laughed. Of course, Charlie. Today the garden is all yours. You can run around and have as much fun as you want. George and Anderson went out onto the balcony, where there was a table with tea and snacks. From there, they could see Charlie scampering around the garden, exploring every nook and cranny with enthusiasm. He's so happy, Anderson said, watching the boy with a thoughtful look. It's amazing how a child's joy can light up everything around him. George nodded and looked fondly at his grandson. Charlie has been through a lot, but he's never lost that joy. I just want to make sure he has a chance to live a long and healthy life. Anderson was silent for a moment, seemingly self-absorbed. I lost my son when he was little. I'd never fully recovered from that loss. I think that's why I cut myself off from the world so much. And then you came along. George looked at him and felt the depth of what Anderson was revealing to him. It's hard to understand something like that. I don't know what I would do if I lost Charlie. He's all I have. Anderson sighed. Anderson sighed. You're lucky to have him, George. He's a special boy. And somehow he's made me realize that I need to be more connected to people, to the world. Being around you has helped me realize that." George smiled, recognizing the sincerity in Anderson's words. "Sometimes people come into our lives for reasons we don't understand at first, but I think there's always a reason." The two sat in silence for a while, watching Charlie run around, laugh, and have fun. When Anderson saw the scene, he got up and approached the boy. "Charlie, would you like to take a walk in my secret garden?" he asked, smiling. Charlie stopped walking and looked at him curiously. "Secret garden? I didn't know you had one." Anderson laughed softly. "Not many people know about it. It's a special place where I like to think and relax." "Come, I'll show you." Charlie enthusiastically followed Anderson to an inconspicuous path at the back of the house, and George watched from a distance, smiling. He knew that this day was more than just a walk. It was the beginning of an unexpected friendship and a change that was taking place for both him and Mr. Anderson. As Charlie and Mr. Anderson disappeared down the secret garden path, George looked out on the balcony and reflected on how life had changed in such a short time. From a simple gesture of honesty had come new opportunities, a friendship he could never have foreseen, and, most importantly, hope for a better future for Charlie. Anderson's words echoed in George's mind. Sometimes fate has a funny habit of putting the right people in our path at the right time. And that day, George knew more than ever that fate had placed John Anderson in their lives for something far greater than he could have ever imagined. When Anderson and Charlie returned from the garden, the three of them spent the rest of the afternoon together, laughing and chatting as if they were part of the same family. And for the first time in many years, George had the feeling that things were finally calming down. The morning was calm and sunny when George and Charlie arrived at the clinic John Anderson had directed them to. The appointment with the specialist was the first step in Charlie's treatment, and the excitement was palpable. George was nervous, although he tried to keep his composure so as not to worry his grandson. He knew how much this moment meant, not only for Charlie's health, but also for his future. "Grandpa, do you think the doctor will cure me for good?" asked Charlie with hopeful eyes. George looked at the boy, smiled, and put his hand on his shoulder. "I'm sure of it, Charlie. He's the best doctor you could ever have. We're in good hands." They entered the clinic and were greeted by a receptionist who led them into an elegant waiting room, the likes of which George had never seen before. The walls were bright, and there were large potted plants that gave a sense of calm. George sat in one of the comfortable armchairs while Charlie surveyed his surroundings with curious eyes. "I've never been in a place like this, Grandpa. It's like one of those movie hospitals," Charlie said, admiring the surroundings. George laughed, but inside he felt the weight of all that this moment meant. For him, it was a dream come true, something he could never have imagined on his own. He knew Anderson's help had been vital, and his heart filled with gratitude again. Soon after, a nurse approached him and called Charlie's name. They got up and followed the woman down the hallway to the office of Dr. Matthews, the specialist Anderson had recommended. As they entered the room, they were greeted by a middle-aged man with a warm smile and steady gaze. He rose to greet them. "You must be George and Charlie," the doctor said, shaking George's hand first and then bowing to greet Charlie. "John Anderson has spoken very highly of you. It's a pleasure to finally meet you." George smiled back, feeling a sense of relief at the realization that they were in good hands. "It's a pleasure, Doctor. We are very grateful for this opportunity." Dr. Matthews nodded and invited them to sit down. "Well, let's start with a quick chat, Charlie. I want to get a feel for how you're feeling and get to know your condition better. Then we'll run some tests." Charlie, who was always candid, began to talk about how he had been feeling over the past few months. He described the difficulties he had faced, the constant pain and fatigue, while George watched silently, feeling a mixture of sadness and hope. He knew that with the right treatment, everything could get better. After a few minutes, Dr. Matthews got up and led Charlie to an adjoining examination room. George waited in the treatment room, his heart beating faster than he dared admit. He looked around, trying to distract himself, but thoughts of Charlie's future kept invading his mind. Time seemed to pass slowly as he waited. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Charlie and the doctor returned to the room. The boy smiled, which immediately relieved George. "Well," Dr. Matthews began and sat back down. "I've done the preliminary tests and, as we expected, the treatment will be lengthy, but I have good news." Charlie's case is completely treatable. With proper aftercare and medication, you will be able to lead a completely normal life." The doctor's words brought tears of relief to George's eyes. It was as if a huge weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He looked at Charlie, who also looked happier. "Did you hear that, Charlie? It's going to be all right," George said with a hint of excitement in his voice. Charlie smiled, his eyes sparkling. "Will I be able to play ball again, Grandpa?" Dr. Matthews laughed and nodded. "Yes, Charlie. You'll be able to play ball and do whatever you want, but we have to get the treatment right. Then you'll get better and better." George couldn't express how much that meant to him. For years, he had felt guilty for not being able to do more for his grandson, for not being able to afford the treatment Charlie so desperately needed. And now, thanks to John Anderson's generosity and Dr. Matthews' expertise, the future looked bright at last. "Dr. Matthews, I can't thank you enough," George said, his voice still trembling. The doctor smiled and shook his head. "No need to thank me, George. I'm just doing my job, and John Anderson has already told me he'll take care of all the treatment expenses. So you can concentrate on taking care of Charlie's health and leave the rest to us." The gratitude George felt was immense. He didn't know how their lives had changed so drastically in such a short time, but he knew it was all coming together somehow. "Charlie," Dr. Matthews said, standing up, "I want you to come back next week so we can start treatment. I'm sure we'll be successful." Charlie nodded excitedly and shook the doctor's hand. "I'll be here, doctor." With relieved hearts, George and Charlie said goodbye to Dr. Matthews and left the clinic. Outside, the sun was shining and the world seemed clearer and fuller of possibilities. As they walked to the waiting car, George looked at Charlie and smiled. "Did you see that, boy? It's all coming together just like I told you." Charlie looked at his grandfather with his eyes bright and hopeful. "I knew it, Grandpa. I always knew everything would work out." George took a deep breath and felt the slight breeze on his face. He knew the road would still be long, but now, with the help of Anderson and Dr. Matthews, there was hope, and that hope was enough to keep him going. "Let's go home, Charlie. Today is a good day to celebrate," George said, feeling an optimism he hadn't experienced in a long time. And so the two of them set off together, knowing that for the first time in a long time, the future really did seem bright. The days following the appointment with Dr. Matthews passed at a different pace. There was a lightness in the air that George and Charlie had not felt in a long time. George, now more hopeful, began to look to the future with a new perspective. He knew Charlie's treatment would be long, but at last there was a clear direction, and, with John Anderson's help, he no longer had to worry about the financial side of things. That afternoon, as George was organizing some papers at home, the phone rang again. It was Anderson. "George, how are you? How was your appointment with Dr. Matthews?" he asked in an affectionate tone. "It was excellent, John. Dr. Matthews is an amazing professional, and he gave us some good news. Charlie still has a long way to go, but the treatment will work. We're very relieved," George replied, gratitude in his voice. "I'm glad to hear that. Charlie's a strong boy. He's going to pull through. I wanted to invite you over again for the weekend. I'd love to spend more time with you and talk about some plans I have in mind." George smiled. The unexpected friendship between him and Anderson was developing naturally, something he could never have foreseen. "Of course, John. We'll be there. I'm sure Charlie will like it." On Saturday, George and Charlie were once again welcomed at Anderson's mansion. The atmosphere was welcoming, and Anderson seemed more at ease than ever, as if her presence had brought a new energy to the house. The millionaire led her into the living room, where everything was set up for a quiet evening. "I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation, George," Anderson began as she poured herself some tea. "And I've realized that, in helping Charlie, I'm also rediscovering something important in my own life." George leaned back in his chair, curious to understand what Anderson was getting at. "What are you getting at, John?" Anderson smiled and looked at Charlie, who was playing with one of the pet dogs on the rug. "After I lost my son, I cut myself off from the world for many years. I focused all my energy on work and distanced myself from the things that really mattered. When I saw you and Charlie, I realized I needed to reconnect with people." George nodded, recognizing the depth of Anderson's words. "I hear you, John. When my wife died, I felt like the world had lost its meaning. But Charlie gave me meaning. I think he's helping you find yours, too. Anderson laughed softly. You're right, George. And that's precisely why I've come up with something. I want to be a part of your lives in a more meaningful way. I'm offering you more than Charlie's treatment. I want to make sure you have a solid foundation from now on. George was silent and took in the words. Anderson's offer was greater than he could ever have imagined. He had always been a proud man, used to taking care of his own problems. But he knew that at this moment he was accepting Anderson's help not only for himself, but for Charlie as well. What are you saying, John? Asked George with a serious but kind expression. I'm saying that I want to guarantee Charlie's future. I'm going to open an account for him so that when he grows up, he'll have the resources he needs to make his own dreams come true. And, George, I want you to consider working with me. I'm not offering you just any job. I'm offering you a partnership. I want your honesty and wisdom by my side. George was dumbfounded. Anderson's generosity seemed to know no bounds. But what touched him most was his genuine desire to help and be present in his life. This was about more than money or charity. It was a friendship that was solidified in mutual trust. John, I don't know what to say. You've done so much for us already. I don't know if we deserve this, George said, still taking in the magnitude of the offer. It's not about deserving, George. You show me something I thought I'd lost. Pope, that's worth more than any fortune. What's more, you and Charlie have shown me the true meaning of connection and family. I want to be a part of that. Anderson responded with a sincerity that touched George deeply. Charlie, who was listening to the conversation while petting the dog, approached George and Anderson with a beaming face. I'd love to have you stay with us a while longer, Mr. Anderson. We could be a great family. Anderson looked at Charlie and ran his hand through his hair with a smile. That's exactly what I want, Charlie. I want to be close to you and help you in any way I can. George, who was teary-eyed, nodded. We accept it, John. We accept it with gratitude. I've always taught Charlie the importance of being honest and doing the right thing. And I know that with you by our side, we can make sure he has the best possible future. Anderson smiled, relieved and excited. Thank you, George. This means a lot to me. We're going to build something special together. Not just a business, but a future that brings us together as a family. The rest of the afternoon passed in laughter and light conversation as the bonds between George, Charlie, and Anderson grew even closer. The unexpected friendship that had begun with the return of a backpack was turning into something much greater, a lifelong partnership based on honesty, generosity, and love. As George and Charlie said goodbye that night, a new sense of belonging arose in their hearts. They knew they were no longer alone. And for the first time in many years, George was certain that the future would not only be bright, but also full of new possibilities and, above all, unbreakable bonds. As they walked home, Charlie, ever curious, looked up at his grandfather. Grandpa, Mr. Anderson is part of our family now, isn't he? George smiled and shook his grandson's hand. Yes, Charlie, I think he's part of our lives now. And with him by our side, we can handle anything. The two moved on, knowing that fate had given them far more than they could ever have wished for. A new family built on honesty and kindness. After that memorable day at the Anderson mansion, time passed quickly and George and Charlie's lives began to change in ways they could never have imagined. With Charlie's ongoing treatment and Anderson's constant support, their lives seemed more stable than ever. George no longer had to worry about medical expenses and could focus on something he never had before, the opportunity to build a secure future for him and Charlie. One day, as George was preparing breakfast, Charlie came running into the kitchen, more energetic than ever. Grandpa, I got an idea today. Can we go see Mr. Anderson? It's been ages since we've been to see him, Charlie said, his eyes sparkling with excitement. George laughed, finding his grandson's excitement amusing. I think we can do that, yes. But maybe we should call him first, just to make sure he's home. Good idea, Grandpa. I want to show him how strong I've become. Charlie tensed his thin arms, proud of the progress he was making with the treatment. George looked at his grandson and felt his heart fill with gratitude. Every day, Charlie seemed stronger, healthier. The boy, who had once been frail and tired, was now running around the house full of life. And all this was only possible because of Anderson's generosity. "I'll make the call," George said and picked up the phone. A few minutes later, Anderson answered on the other end of the line in an excited voice. "George, it's good to hear your voice. How are things going?" "We're fine, John. Charlie was wondering if we could come see you today. He's full of energy and looking forward to seeing you," George replied, smiling. "Sure, I'd love to see you guys. Come by anytime. I'm home today and would love to spend the day with my friend Charlie," Anderson replied. After hanging up the phone, George broke the news to Charlie, who almost jumped for joy. "Let's go. Let's go now." George laughed and adjusted Charlie's jacket before they left. "Take it easy, kid." "We'll take it easy." When they arrived at the villa, they were greeted warmly by Anderson, as always. But this time there was something different in the atmosphere. Anderson seemed especially pensive, as if he had something important on his mind. As Charlie ran off to play in the garden, Anderson called George to a corner of the room. "George, I want to talk to you about something I've been thinking about for a while," Anderson began in a serious but friendly tone. George nodded curiously. "Of course, John, what is it?" Anderson sighed, as if organizing his thoughts before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot about my life over the past few months, about what I want to do from now on. You and Charlie have given me back something I had lost, a purpose. And I want to make sure you always have what you need." George was already grateful for all Anderson had done, but he knew his friend was about to suggest something bigger. "You've done so much for us already, John. I don't know how we could take any more." Anderson shook his head and smiled slightly. "It's not about taking on more, George. It's about creating something for the future. I have no heirs, and as time goes on, I realize I want to leave something that will really make a difference. I thought I'd invest in something that would directly benefit Charlie, and you, of course." George frowned and tried to understand. "What exactly did you have in mind?" "I want to set up a fund for Charlie that will provide him with resources for the future, either for his studies or whatever he wants to do. I also wanted to be part of my inner circle and help me with some of the projects I have in mind. I want to invest in something bigger, and you are the person I trust to be by my side." George was silent for a few moments, internalizing the weight of the proposal. He had always been a humble man, used to striving for every small accomplishment in life. Now he had the opportunity not only to secure Charlie's future, but also to work alongside a friend on something meaningful. "John, I don't know what to say. This is something I never would have imagined. I don't know if I'm the right person for this, but if you trust me, I'll do the best I can." Anderson smiled and held out his hand. "I know you're the right person, George, and together we're going to accomplish something great." George shook Anderson's hand, feeling that that moment marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. It was more than a financial offer. It was a partnership, a friendship that had blossomed into something deep and meaningful. As they discussed the details, Charlie came running back into the room, smiling. "Mr. Anderson, the garden is fantastic. And you know what? I've made it all the way through without getting tired," he said with a proud expression on his face. Anderson laughed and crouched down to be level with Charlie. "That's fantastic, Charlie. I'm so proud of you. You're getting stronger every day." Charlie grinned from ear to ear, and George felt a sense of peace at the sight of his grandson that he hadn't felt in a long time. He knew Charlie's future was secure no matter what. And what was more, he had found not only a benefactor in John Anderson, but a true friend. That night, as they prepared for the trip home, George looked at Anderson with gratitude. "John, thank you for everything. Not only for what you're doing for Charlie, but for the friendship we've forged. I'll never be able to repay you the way you deserve." Anderson put his hand on George's shoulder and smiled. "You already have, George. Honesty, true friendship, those are the things that really count. And you've given it all back to me." As the car drove them home, George looked out the window and felt encouraged. He knew he still had a lot of work ahead of him, but now, with Anderson by his side and Charlie's future secure, he felt like his life was finally on the right track. Charlie, who was still sitting beside him full of anticipation, asked, "Grandpa, do you think Mr. Anderson likes us as much as we like him?" George smiled and put his hand on Charlie's. "I'm sure he does, son. He's part of our family now." And as the city lights flashed past the car window, George knew they were opening a new chapter, a chapter filled with hope, friendship, and a bright future. It had been a few weeks since the last meeting with John Anderson, and George was beginning to adjust to the new reality that life was offering him. Charlie's treatment was progressing well, and the boys seemed to be getting stronger every day. The new routine brought with it a peace of mind that George had not felt in years. The constant financial worries were gone, and the prospect of a secure future for Charlie was beginning to materialize. On a quiet morning, George was sipping his coffee and looking out the window of his modest home when the phone rang. He picked up the receiver, expecting another call from Anderson, who often called to see how they were doing. "George, it's John," said the familiar voice on the other end of the line. "I'd like to invite you to an important meeting. I'm hosting a benefit at my house next weekend, and I think it would be a good opportunity for us to talk more about the background I mentioned to Charlie." George was silent for a moment, surprised but flattered. He knew Anderson was up to something big, but he hadn't yet grasped the full extent of the significance of this event. "Of course, John. We'll be there. Sounds like a wonderful opportunity," George replied, feeling a mixture of nervousness and gratitude. "Wonderful. I'm sure you'll enjoy. And it's a chance for you to meet some important people who can help shape our plans," Anderson said with enthusiasm in his voice. The morning of the event, George and Charlie carefully prepared. Although George was not used to attending large events, he knew this was a special opportunity, not only to bond with Anderson, but also to solidify plans for Charlie's future. When they arrived at the mansion, they were greeted by a team of servants who led them to the large garden where the event was being held. There were several well-dressed people, elegantly decorated tables, and an atmosphere of sophistication that George had never experienced before. He felt a slight sense of unease, but was soon reassured when Anderson approached him with a warm smile. "George, Charlie, how nice of you to come," Anderson said, shaking George's hand and leaning over to greet Charlie. "I'm so glad you're here. Today is an important day for all of us." George smiled, trying not to let it show how impressed he was by the splendor of the event. "It's a great party, John. I've never been to anything like it." Anderson laughed. "I guess it's a new experience, but you belong here as much as anyone. And today, more than ever, I want you to know how important you are to me." As they chatted, several guests approached Anderson, greeting him and chatting briefly about the event. With each person who arrived, Anderson introduced George and Charlie and briefly explained their story, always with a gleam of pride in his eyes. "This is George, the most honest man I've ever met, and his grandson Charlie, who is receiving treatment that we all hope will be successful," Anderson would often say, making George feel like he was part of something bigger. As the afternoon progressed, Anderson led George to a quieter area of the garden, where they could talk more freely. He put his hand on George's shoulder and began to speak in a more serious tone. "George, I wanted to take this opportunity to tell you a little more about my plans. It's not just about the fun for Charlie that we've been talking about. I want you to be part of something bigger. As you know, I already have more money than I could ever spend in a lifetime, but I want to spend it on something worthwhile." George nodded and listened intently. "I understand that, John. But what do you have in mind?" "I'm setting up a foundation to help kids in difficult situations like Charlie. Kids who need medical care, emotional support, and often a new chance at life. And I want you to be my partner in this. Your experience, your worldview, these are things I need to make sure this foundation has the impact I want it to have." George was speechless for a few moments. The idea of being part of something so big was something he had never imagined. He had always been a simple man, used to living modestly, but now he was being offered the opportunity to change lives, just as he had changed Charlie's. "John, I don't know what to say. This is so much more than I ever imagined," George said, overwhelmed by his feelings. Anderson smiled. "You don't have to say anything, George. You just have to keep being the way you are. Your honesty, your dedication, that's what I want to bring to this foundation. Together we can do something really worthwhile." George nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also the pride of having been chosen for something so important. "I'll do my best, John. I promise." As the two spoke, Charlie scampered around the garden, laughing and playing with the other children attending the event. George looked at his grandson and felt a surge of excitement. He knew that everything that was happening there was to secure Charlie's future and that of other children who, like him, needed a new lease on life. "Anderson, noticing George's expression, smiled as well. "That's why we're here, George, to make sure kids like Charlie have a full and happy life. And with you by my side, I'm sure we can make it happen." The event continued with speeches and presentations about the foundation's plans. And although George still felt a little out of place among such luxury, he knew that his and Charlie's lives were about to change irrevocably. Not only had he found a friend in Anderson, but also a purpose, something that would give meaning to the next few years of his life. When the event was over and they returned to the car on the way home, Charlie looked at George with a beaming smile. "Grandpa, I had a great time today. Mr. Anderson is the best, isn't he?" George looked at his grandson and felt great gratitude for all that had happened. "Yes, Charlie, he's the best. And thanks to him, our future has never been brighter." And so, that afternoon, George knew that although the road ahead still held many challenges, he and Charlie were surrounded by new opportunities and a friendship that would take them much further than they could have ever imagined. A few days after the benefit, George was still thinking about everything that had happened. The idea of being part of Anderson's foundation was something he never would have imagined. And although he was grateful, he knew the responsibility would be great. He wanted to do everything right, not just for Charlie, but for all the other children who could be helped. It was a quiet morning when George received another call from Anderson. This time his friend's voice sounded different, as if he had something on his mind. "George, good morning," Anderson began in a more serious tone. "Do you have a moment for me? There's something I need to discuss with you personally." George, a bit disturbed by the tone, replied, "Of course, John. Is something the matter?" "No, not really," Anderson quickly replied. "It's something important I want to talk about. Why don't you come and see me at the villa? I think it's better if we talk face to face." Interested and a little apprehensive, George agreed. Shortly thereafter, he and Charlie were on their way to the mansion. When they arrived, they were greeted at the entrance by Anderson, who led them directly into the study, an imposing room adorned with antique books and artwork. "George, there's something I haven't mentioned to you yet," Anderson said, and motioned for him to sit down. Charlie hurried to explore the room as usual, fascinated by the exotic artifacts and bookshelves filled with books. "I hear you, John," George said, concerned about what was about to happen. Anderson settled into the armchair next to George and took a deep breath before continuing. "I've been thinking a lot about the future, about what I want to leave behind. The foundation is just one part of it. But aside from the foundation, I also want you to have something that belongs to you exclusively." George frowned, confused. "What do you mean, John? What are you trying to tell me?" Anderson stood up and began pacing the room, obviously thinking about his words. "George, I've amassed a fortune over the years, but I've never had any heirs. As you know, I lost my son when he was very young. And ever since then, this house, all this money, has been more of a burden than anything else. Now that you and Charlie are in my life, I know I can use it for something bigger. I want to make sure you have a home of your own." George was stunned. "John, are you saying that dash?" Anderson turned to him and smiled. "What I'm saying is that I want this villa to be yours. I've given it a lot of thought, and it makes sense. I'm going to stay here for a while, of course, but in the future, when I'm gone, I want the house to be yours and Charlie's." George was silent for a few moments, trying to comprehend what Anderson had just said. It was an offer he would never have imagined. The mansion was magnificent, something completely out of his reality, and now Anderson was offering it to him and his grandson. "John, that's a lot," George said, trying to find the right words. "I don't even know how to process it." Anderson laughed softly. "I know it seems like a lot, George, but think of it as a thank you. You've given me back something I thought I'd lost. A purpose, a reason to keep going. And I want to make sure Charlie has everything he needs in the future. This house can be his home, your home." George looked at Charlie, who was sitting on the floor, flipping through an old book with curious eyes. The boy was full of life, and George knew that all he wanted was to give his grandson the best possible future. But accepting something so big still made him uncomfortable. "John, I don't know how to accept something like this. I was always a simple man who lived with what I had. This is so much more than I could have imagined." Anderson walked over to George and put a hand on his shoulder. "I understand you, George, and I'm not asking you to change. I just want you to know that this house could be yours someday. I'm not going anywhere yet, but I want you and Charlie to have a place in the future where you feel safe and where you can build something together." George took a deep breath, still struggling with the thought. "I thank you, John. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. I'll think about it, and we'll keep working quietly. This is all very new to me." Anderson nodded, understanding what George was feeling. "Of course, George. There's no need to rush into it. The important thing is for you to know that this door is always open. And in the meantime, we need to take care of the foundation. I believe that together we will change many lives." George smiled, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also the reassurance of having a friend in Anderson. "Yes, John, let's do it right." The two embraced. And in that moment, George knew his life was taking a turn he never would have imagined. His friendship with Anderson, which had begun so unexpectedly, was becoming something deeper and more meaningful. Before leaving, Anderson called Charlie, who was busy with his books. "Charlie, come here," Anderson told him with a smile. "I wanted to ask you something." Charlie ran to him excitedly. "What is it, Mr. Anderson?" Anderson knelt down at Charlie's height and looked the boy in the eye. "If someday this house is yours, do you promise to take care of it and make it a place full of life and joy, like you do everywhere you go?" Charlie smiled without hesitation. "I promise, Mr. Anderson. I'll take very good care of everything." Anderson smiled and hugged Charlie warmly. "I know you will, son. I know you will." As George and Charlie said goodbye to Anderson and made their way home, George felt that, for the first time in many years, the future didn't just look bright. It seemed full of possibilities he had never dared to dream of. And with Anderson by his side, he knew he was on the right track to ensure the best for Charlie and the legacy they had built together. A few weeks after the revealing conversation about the mansion, George felt his life had finally taken an unexpectedly positive turn. He was settling into his new role alongside Anderson, helping to organize the foundation's first steps and becoming more actively involved in planning how they could impact the lives of so many other children. Charlie, for his part, continued to respond well to treatment and was showing clear signs of improvement. One afternoon, as George and Charlie rested at home after a long day of activities, the phone rang again. It was Anderson. "George, I have some news. I wanted to invite you to a meeting with some of the directors who will help us run the foundation. It's important that you be there because your perspective will be crucial in helping us structure everything in the best possible way." George, ever modest, hesitated for a moment. "John, I have no experience in this sort of thing. You know, I've always been a simple man. I don't know if I'll be able to contribute as much as you expect." Anderson laughed on the other end of the line. "George, you're here precisely because your simplicity brings clarity to this project. Don't worry about formality or experience. We've learned that over time. What I need is your honesty and your worldview." "They are our guide." George sighed but accepted the invitation. "If you think I can help, I'll be there." On the day of the meeting, George put on his best clothes and prepared Charlie to be comfortable during the visit. When they arrived at the mansion, Anderson was already waiting for them, ready to introduce George to the other directors and investors in the foundation. The boardroom was large and bright, with large windows overlooking the expansive garden. It was an imposing setting, but Anderson made George feel at ease. "Gentlemen, this is George," Anderson said, introducing him to the others. "His and Charlie's story inspired me to create this foundation. His honesty and integrity are qualities we should all follow. He will be by my side every step of the way." The other men and women present nodded and gave George a warm smile, which immediately put him at ease. Charlie, sitting next to his grandfather, watched everything carefully, taking in every detail of this new reality. During the meeting, the directors discussed the foundation's action plan, fundraising and next steps to help children in need. Anderson, who always had clear ideas, led the meeting with energy, but often turned to George for his opinion. "George, what do you think of this idea?" asked Anderson once, looking directly at him. George, still surprised at the importance attached to his opinion, thought a moment before answering. "I think it's a good idea, but we need to make sure that every penny is put to good use. I know a lot of people who were in a similar situation to me before you helped us, and I know that every little resource can make a big difference. We need to make sure this money goes to those who need it most." The directors nodded, impressed by the simplicity and depth of what George was saying. Anderson smiled, pleased with his friend's input. "Exactly, George. That's what I want. For this foundation to have a responsibility to change lives in the right way." As the conversation progressed, George became increasingly comfortable and realized that his practical, down-to-earth perspective was valuable in this context. He knew the real needs of struggling families, something many of those present had never experienced firsthand, despite their good intentions. After several hours of productive dialogue, the meeting came to an end. The directors and investors began to leave, but Anderson asked George and Charlie to stay a little longer. He led them to the villa's balcony, from where they could watch the sun set over the large garden. "George, I wanted to thank you for today," Anderson said in a more personal tone. "You brought something to this meeting that no one else could bring. Real insight into what it's like to live with hardship. And that's exactly what this foundation needs." George looked at his friend, still surprised that he was there. "John, you've given me so much. I just want to make sure other people have the same opportunities you've given us." Anderson nodded and looked at Charlie, who was running across the lawn. "That's the goal, George, to help kids like Charlie have a chance at a full life. And I want you to know that this is just the beginning. We're going to grow a lot more with this project." George looked out at the horizon and felt the gentle breeze on his face. He knew the journey ahead would be full of challenges, but he was also excited about the opportunities that awaited him. For the first time in many years, he was not only surviving, but making a difference. Charlie, tired from pacing the yard, returned to his two friends, huddled next to George, and looked at Anderson with a smile on his face. "Mr. Anderson, what's going to happen now?" the boy asked with his typical curiosity. Anderson smiled and crouched down to be level with Charlie. "Well, boy, we're going to change a lot of kids' lives, just like we changed yours." George surveyed the scene with a heart full of gratitude. He never would have imagined that the simple decision to return a lost backpack would change their lives so much. Now he had the opportunity to join Anderson in helping others find the same path of hope and change. "Let's do it together, Charlie," George said, putting his arm around his grandson. "Let's be part of something much bigger than ourselves." And as the sun set over the mansion, they knew the future was full of new possibilities, not just for Charlie and George, but for all the lives that would cross their path, thanks to the kindness and purpose Anderson had found in their friendship. It was the beginning of a new era in which honesty, friendship, and a desire to help others would form the basis of something great. A few months after the official launch of the foundation, George and Charlie's lives were filled with new responsibilities and opportunities. George was now devoting much of his time to the foundation's activities, making sure that the money raised reached the families and children who needed it most. At the same time, Charlie's treatment continued to progress well, and the energetic boy often accompanied his grandfather to events and visits in the foundation's beneficiary communities. One day, over a quiet lunch at the Anderson mansion, he brought up a new idea that had been maturing in his mind. "George, I've been thinking about something big, something that will require more of us, but could have a huge impact," Anderson began, as they enjoyed their meal on the sunny terrace. Charlie was playing with one of the dogs in the house, but George realized right away that Anderson was about to suggest something important. "What are you up to now, John?" asked George, curious, but willing to listen to whatever Anderson had in mind. So far, all of Anderson's ideas have been innovative and intended to change lives. "I've been thinking about starting a mentoring program," Anderson said with a twinkle in his eye. "Something that more directly involves the people we help. I don't want the foundation to be limited to donations and money. I want it to be a project where people like you and I can invest our time, knowledge, and life experience to mentor young people who need guidance." George paused for a moment and thought about this suggestion. "You mean we would not only contribute financial support, but also invest time in teaching and mentoring these young people?" "Exactly," Anderson said enthusiastically. "Many of these young people come from broken homes or situations where they've never had anyone to guide them. They need more than money. They need role models, people they can trust and learn from." George nodded slowly. "That makes a lot of sense. I grew up in a family where there weren't many opportunities, and I know how hard it is to find someone who cares enough to show them the way. This program could make a difference." Anderson smiled, pleased by George's reaction. "I knew you'd understand. And who better to mentor than you, George? Your history, your honesty, and all you've done for Charlie. These young people need someone like you to show them that there is a way forward even in the worst of circumstances." George was humbled by Anderson's words, but he also knew it was a great responsibility. He had always tried to live a life of simplicity and integrity, and the idea of passing on those values to young people facing challenges similar to his own thrilled him greatly. "I'll do it, John," George said firmly. "If I can help even one young person, it will have been worth it." Anderson nodded, satisfied with George's response. "That's the attitude we need. And, of course, you won't be alone. I'll also bring in other mentors, people who have something to teach. We'll make sure all the young people have a strong support network." As they talked, Charlie, who until then had been distracted with his dog, walked over and overheard part of the conversation. "What are you two up to now?" the boy asked curiously, pulling up a chair next to George. George smiled at his grandson. "Mr. Anderson is planning something big, son. We're going to help more young people, not just with money, but by teaching them to find their own way." Charlie, his eyes shining with excitement, exclaimed, "That's great. Can I help too?" Anderson laughed and gave Charlie a gentle pat on the shoulder. "You're already helping, kid. Your story of overcoming is an example to all these young people. And who knows, years from now, you might be a mentor too." Charlie grinned from ear to ear, feeling important. "I'll be the best mentor of them all." George and Anderson laughed, but Charlie's comment only confirmed how much he had matured in the past few months. The boy who had once been sick and tired now exuded energy and a zest for life that George would always be grateful for. Late in the afternoon, after the talk, George and Charlie drove home, and a comfortable silence in the car allowed George to reflect on all that had happened. The mentoring program would be a new challenge, but also an opportunity to give back some of what he had received. He knew better than anyone the impact that the right guidance can have on a person's life. When he got home, George sat on the balcony while Charlie scampered around the yard, still full of energy. He thought about all the turns his life had taken since the day they found the backpack in the park. Who would have thought that a simple act of honesty would bring about so many changes? Now she wasn't just taking care of Charlie. She was helping to build something much bigger, something that could change more than just her own life. That night, before falling asleep, George looked at Charlie, who was already sound asleep, and smiled. He knew the work ahead of him would be difficult, but he also knew he was on the right track. With Anderson by his side, and with the support of his own life experience, he was about to do something that would not only change Charlie's future, but that of many other young people. "Let's do it right," George whispered decisively to himself. And with that, he closed his eyes, knowing that the next day would bring new opportunities and challenges, and he was more than ready to meet them. The months following the launch of the Foundation's expansion were characterized by George and Anderson's intense commitment. The success of the mentoring project and the positive impact it had on the lives of so many young people filled both of them with great satisfaction, but also with the realization that there was still much to be done. The program, which initially covered a few cities, began to expand to other regions, and George, with his humble nature and life experience, took it upon himself to lead this expansion with wisdom and heart. One morning, George was sitting on his front porch drinking coffee and thinking about how his life had changed since he had returned Anderson's backpack. Charlie was playing in the yard as usual, now full of energy and health. The boy had gone from a sickly, frail child to a person full of life, and this change was George's greatest treasure. He knew that his journey thus far, though difficult, had prepared him for something much greater. As he watched his grandson, George's phone rang. It was Anderson, with whom he spoke almost daily to discuss new plans and news about the Foundation. "George, you have to come over. We have something important to discuss," Anderson said in his usual calm voice, but with an air of urgency. "Of course, John. I'm on my way," George replied, already sensing that something big was about to unfold. When he arrived at the Anderson mansion, he was greeted with his usual warmth, but noticed that there were more people than usual. There were more people in the house, and it looked like a meeting was about to begin. Anderson was waiting for him in his office, where some of the directors and partners of the foundation were already gathered. "George, I'm glad you're here. We have something important to discuss," Anderson began, gesturing for George to take his place at the table. "John, what's going on here? What's all the fuss about?" asked George, sensing that something important was about to happen. Anderson smiled. "Our mentoring program has been a much bigger success than we imagined. The impact we had in the first few cities was so positive that other regions and even international organizations have contacted us. They want to replicate the model elsewhere." George was surprised. He knew the program worked well, but he had never considered that it could be transferred to other countries. "Other countries?" asked George, still trying to process the information. "This is much bigger than I imagined, John." "Exactly, George. And that's why I called you in. I want you to lead this international expansion," Anderson said firmly. "You know the program better than anyone. Your history, your life experience is at the core of this project. I can't think of anyone better to lead it." George took a deep breath. The idea of expanding the program to other countries was fantastic, but also frightening. He had always been a simple man, someone who had never dreamed of running something so monumental. But at the same time, he knew he couldn't turn down the opportunity. Anderson believed in him, and more importantly, George thought it was the right thing to do. "John, I don't know if I'm ready for something this big," George hones in. "I've always led a simple life, and this feels like something that's not my reality." Anderson reached over and put a hand on George's shoulder. "George, you're ready. You always have been. You've brought this program this far with your dedication and honesty. All you have to do now is continue to be who you are. We'll build the rest together." George looked at the faces of the other directors and partners, who nodded in agreement. They believed in him, as did Anderson. And for the first time, George began to believe that he really could be the right person to lead this expansion. "If you trust me, John, then I'm in," George said firmly. "We'll take this program wherever it needs to go." Anderson smiled, pleased with George's response. "I knew I could count on you, my friend. Let's start planning right away. We have a lot of work to do." As the meeting progressed, George assimilated information about what this new phase of the foundation would look like. They talked about international partnerships, new mentoring teams, and how to adapt the program to the different cultures and needs of each region. It was a big challenge, but George was up for it. When the meeting ended, Anderson asked George to stay a while longer. They went out onto the porch of the mansion, from where they could see the manicured garden and feel the light afternoon breeze. "George, I want to tell you something else," Anderson said, now with a more serious tone. "I've been thinking a lot about the future of the foundation, and of course about your and Charlie's future." George looked at Anderson curiously. "What's on your mind, John?" "I have no heirs, George. And in the last few months, I've realized that everything I've accumulated over the course of my life, all this wealth, this mansion, it doesn't make much sense to me if I can't pass it on to someone I trust," Anderson explained with a calmness that betrayed the seriousness of his words. George was silent, feeling the weight of what Anderson was saying. "I want you and Charlie to be the heirs to my legacy," Anderson continued. "I want this mansion and everything I own to be yours when I am no longer here." George felt the world around him stop for a moment. He had never imagined anything like this. The mansion, the Anderson estate, were things he would never have considered owning, and now his friend was offering it all to him. "John, this is a lot. I don't even know where to begin to thank you," George said, visibly moved. "I could never have imagined anything like this." Anderson put his hand on George's shoulder again. "It's not a matter of saying thank you, George. It's a matter of trust. You and Charlie have brought something back into my life that I thought I'd lost forever. A sense of purpose. And I want to make sure that sense continues when I'm no longer here. I wanted to take care of that legacy and make it even greater." George, on the verge of tears, nodded. "I promise you, John, I'll take care of it as best I can. And Charlie, well, he'll grow up knowing how valuable everything you've done for us is." Anderson smirked. "That's what it's all about, George. Building something that goes beyond us." When George returned home with Charlie that night, he couldn't stop thinking about Anderson's words. He had been entrusted with the legacy of a man who had changed his life, and now he had the responsibility to continue that work. As Charlie slept, George sat on the balcony and gazed up at the starry sky. He knew that his life had taken a completely unexpected turn, but he also knew that everything that had happened so far had been the result of one simple decision. The decision to do the right thing, to return the backpack he had found in the park. George closed his eyes for a moment and felt a deep peace come over him. He didn't have all the answers to what the future would hold, but he knew he was on the right track. He had Charlie, he had Anderson by his side, and now he had a mission to continue to help others build a legacy of honesty, compassion, and generosity. In the days that followed, George and Anderson began working on the international expansion of the mentoring program. They traveled together to different countries, meeting new partners and adapting the foundation's model to each culture and local needs. With each trip, George felt he was changing not only the lives of others, but also his own. Charlie, for his part, was getting healthier and happier and always accompanied his grandfather and Anderson on their travels. He had become an important part of the program, inspiring other children with his story of overcoming and proving that anyone can find a path to hope with the right help. And so, the legacy that began with a simple act of honesty has continued to grow and touch lives around the world. George, who now runs one of the largest mentoring networks, knew his journey was far from over. He had only just begun, and with Anderson and Charlie by his side, he was confident that together they could make the world a better place, one young person at a time. Looking to the future, George knew he still had a long way to go. More importantly, he knew that as long as he maintained his integrity and commitment to others, nothing could stop him from achieving the impossible. If you enjoyed this video, comment your age and tell us where in the world you're watching from. And if you'd like to see more content like this, we prepared the next video just for you. Click here to watch